You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
People are driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. The hiring process can be slow and overwhelming. Simplify hiring with Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform. With over 350 million global monthly visitors according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/PODKATZ12. That's Indeed.com/PODKATZ12. Terms and conditions apply.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 472 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all. Thanks for tuning into the podcast. As y'all will recall, with the last show, we talked about the Confederate victory at the Battle of Mansfield on April 8, 1864, and how the fighting that day came to a close down the road at Pleasant Grove.
As you guys will recall, Confederate General Dick Taylor had been appalled by the waffling of Department Commander Kirby Smith. So Taylor had decided to take the bull by the horns and fight the Yankees before they reached Shreveport. Taylor chose the ground where he'd make his stand, near the town of Mansfield, and there on April 8th, he'd won a resounding victory. There was no denying the Battle of Mansfield had been a disaster for the Federals. They fled the field, retreating back down the road they had just marched up.
Both Nathaniel Banks, the political general in charge of the Federals' Red River expedition, and his field commander, William Buell Franklin, bore responsibility for the debacle at Mansfield. Banks' overconfidence had led him to dismiss any possibility that the Confederates would make a stand short of Shreveport, so he was taken by surprise when Dick Taylor did just that.
That Banks didn't expect a fight goes a long way toward explaining the order of march that he'd set for the column, which made little sense otherwise, since it left most of the Federal infantry too far back and behind the Union cavalry's 300 supply and ordnance wagons, all of which meant, should the need arise, it would take a lot of time and an inordinate amount of effort to get the foot soldiers to the front of the column and deployed for battle. Well, as it turned out, most of the Federal infantry never got into the fight at Mansfield or even reached the battlefield. As we know, Emory's division, as it came up, was told to stay back and find a spot to make a defensive stand back down the road to try to stave off complete disaster. And A.J. Smith's 16th Corps troops were marching at the rear of the column, so they, like Emory's men, were never a factor at all regarding what happened at Mansfield.
Near the end of last week's episode, we talked about Emory's stand at Pleasant Grove, or Chapman's Bayou. There, the Confederates, although disorganized by their headlong pursuit of the retreating Federals, nevertheless managed to capture the creek and its all-important water. But then they couldn't dislodge Emory's Yankees from the high ground behind the stream before darkness brought the fighting to a close.
Despite the disaster at Mansfield, Nathaniel Banks was very pleased with Emory's stand as night fell on April 8th. He thought the ridge behind the creek was a wonderful place to defend and decided to hold his ground there. So Banks sent an aide back to Pleasant Hill to order A.J. Smith to bring up his 16th Corps troops.
However, Franklin, who was nursing his broken arm, pointed out that Smith would have just reached Pleasant Hill and likely couldn't reach the front until long after first light the next morning, Saturday the 9th.
And, Franklin continued, when Smith did arrive, would his men be in any shape to fight after covering 22 miles on the 8th and then immediately setting out again and marching another 14 miles overnight? Franklin also pointed out the lack of water at Pleasant Grove, since the Confederates held the creek.
Banks asked the opinion of his friend William Dwight, a brigade commander in Emory's division, and Dwight advised him to abandon the position at Pleasant Grove and continue falling back down the road, and to do so promptly. Banks agreed, and at 10 p.m. the retreat began.
Banks allowed the battered units of the 13th Corps to lead the retreat, followed by the Union cavalry, then the 19th Corps. Dwight's brigade served as rear guard. The column moved slowly through the night. Large numbers of men, separated from their units in the chaos and confusion of the defeat at Mansfield, clogged the road, as did hundreds of wagons from the infantry and cavalry trains. The head of the column didn't reach Pleasant Hill until 8:30 on the morning of the 9th. Back up the road, after daybreak, some Confederate cavalry began harassing the rear guard.
At Pleasant Hill, as small groups of weary men walked, mounted riders trotted, and teamsters wheeled their wagons into the village, A.J. Smith ordered one of his 16th Corps brigades, commanded by Colonel William Shaw, to go out and take up a position on the road west of Pleasant Hill.
Hampered by the bulk of the column that was now streaming down the road, Shaw was forced to abandon it and make his way through the dense woods. Shaw found Emory, who told him to relieve James McMillan's brigade, which had formed up in line of battle south of the road. On the north side of the road was a hill that overlooked the spot where McMillan was stationed.
Shaw relieved McMillan and set up in line of battle with 3 regiments of Iowans on the south side of the road, with 1 regiment of Missourians plus a 4-gun battery on the north side. Once McMillan marched off, the nearest friendly troops, a quarter-mile away, were some New Yorkers and Maine men commanded by Colonel Lewis Benedict.
Dwight's brigade was positioned next to Benedict on the north side of the road, with his regiments facing north. This left both of Shaw's flanks exposed, and curiously, with Dwight's line of battle at right angles to the expected direction of the Confederate attack. In other words, if the rebels approached as expected, they'd hit Dwight's left flank. In any case, Shaw's brigade was positioned over a mile to the west of the village, where the rest of A.J. Smith's troops were located.
Banks set up his headquarters on the east side of the village in Pleasant Hill's largest residence, the Childers House. The village contained a general store, a recently built Methodist church, Pierce Payne College, consisting of 2 unfinished brick buildings, and about a dozen or so houses. Pleasant Hill was situated on the east side of a large cleared field that ran along the Stagecoach Road. To the west of the village was a dense stand of pine trees, and beyond them a very large open field.
That morning, after finding that the Yankees had pulled out of the position they had held when the fighting came to an end the evening before, the Confederate cavalry had set off and followed the retreating enemy and, as we said, harassed the Federal rear guard. It wasn't until around 1 o'clock that afternoon that rebel infantry, in the form of Missourians and Arkansans, led by Brigadier General Thomas Churchill, arrived on the scene about 2 miles west of Pleasant Hill. They had missed the fight at Mansfield, even though they'd pushed hard, marching 45 miles in 36 hours to join Dick Taylor. Now, Taylor wanted them to lead the attack at Pleasant Hill, so he told them to rest for a short while before going into battle.
Taylor then decided to delay the attack 3 hours so the rest of his infantry could also come up and be put into position for an assault on the Federals. He knew he was wasting valuable daylight, but he wanted to get all of his ducks in a row before finishing off the Yankees.
Taking a cue from his time in the Shenandoah Valley with Stonewall Jackson, Dick Taylor's plan of battle here would rely on a flank attack. Churchill was to take his 2 divisions and swing off to the south. Then he'd advance in a northeasterly direction and roll up the Federal left. Covering Churchill's right would be 3 regiments of rebel cavalry that, if the attack was a success, would make for the road in the enemy's rear and cut off the Yankees' retreat.
Walker would deploy his Texas infantry south of the Mansfield Road and advance when he heard the sound of Churchill's attack off in the woods to his right. As he went forward, Walker would strive to connect his right with Churchill's left.
On Walker's left was more Confederate cavalry. Some of the rebel horsemen were tasked with moving around the enemy right and severing the Yankees' connection to the river, while others, should the opportunity arise, would charge straight down the Mansfield Road into Pleasant Hill. Mouton's battered division, which had suffered the heaviest casualties during the fighting the day before, including Mouton himself, was now under the command of Polignac, and it was held in reserve.
Once all was ready, Taylor wrote that, quote, "Orders were given to rely on the bayonet, as we had neither time nor ammunition to waste."
History isn't black and white, yet too often it's presented as such. Grey History, the French Revolution is a long-form history podcast dedicated to exploring the ambiguities and nuances of the past. By contrasting both the experiences of contemporaries and the conclusions of historians, Grey History dives into the detail and unpacks one of the most important and disputed events in human history. From a revolution based on hope and liberty to its descent into the infamous Reign of Terror, there's plenty to discuss and plenty of grey to explore. One can't understand the modern world without understanding the French Revolution. So if you're looking for your next long-form, binge-worthy history podcast, one recommended by universities and loved by enthusiasts, then check out Grey History, the French Revolution today, or simply search for the French Revolution.
All you need is a few minutes to start your day off with something historic when you listen to the This Day in History podcast. Every day there's a new episode for you to listen and learn about what happened that day way back when. Today could be the day a famous mobster met their end, or the first milestone for humans in space. Who knows what history today holds? Find out when you listen and subscribe to This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts. That's This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts.
On the afternoon of the 9th, while Dick Taylor was bringing up his forces and getting them into position to attack to finish the job he had started the day before at Mansfield, on the Federal side of the lines, Nathaniel Banks had been, killing time. As the morning hours wore away, the day grew to be bright and warm. At 11, Banks and his staff rode out to see what was happening at the front, but other than the sputtering fire of skirmishing, nothing much was going on, so he returned to his headquarters. As the warm afternoon hours rolled by and there was no sign the rebels were up to much, officers napped, played cards, or wrote letters.
Banks, nothing if not optimistic, had sent a message off to David Dixon Porter telling the admiral of the fighting the day before, and now sent another telling him that the Army intended to resume its advance on Shreveport that evening.
In other circumstances, Banks' determination to continue the advance on Shreveport might have been admirable, akin to Ulysses S. Grant's resolve to "lick 'em tomorrow" at Shiloh. But here, given the circumstances, Banks' failure on the 9th to more energetically seek out the enemy's intentions was inexcusable, and the lackadaisical attitude at headquarters throughout the afternoon hours that day can, at best, be attributed to overconfidence, and, at worst, qualifies as outright dereliction of duty.
In any case, on the Confederate side of the lines that afternoon, it was around 3 o'clock when Churchill started his trek to the south through the woods to begin his flanking maneuver against the Federal left.
Churchill formed his troops in line of battle with Brigadier General Mosby Parsons' division on the right and his own division, composed of Brigadier General James Tappan's brigade and Colonel Lucien Goss's brigade, on the left. The forest, where in many places visibility was limited by the trees and brush to mere yards, made movement difficult, as did the broken and hilly ground.
After Churchill's Missourians and Arkansans disappeared into the woods, Taylor began a countdown to the start of the battle. He gave Churchill an hour and a half to get into position. Then, at 4:30, a dozen artillery pieces opened up on the Federal 4-gun battery with Shaw's Union infantry stationed north of the road.
The outnumbered Federal guns stood the fire for about 30 minutes, but then withdrew. At the same time, Taylor heard firing off to the right, indicating Churchill's attack was going in. This was the signal for Walker's Texans to begin their advance, and at 5 p.m., they started forward.
Confederate Cavalry Commander Tom Green saw that outgunned Union battery limber up and pull out, and he mistakenly thought it was a sign the Federal position at that spot was collapsing. So he ordered the rebel horsemen who were ready to charge down the road and into Pleasant Hill to start off. However, Shaw's Federal Infantry Brigade was still standing firm, and the Yankees poured a devastating fire into the Confederate cavalrymen, shattering their hopeless charge.
It was a different story, though, when the advance of Walker's Texas infantry brought them into contact with Shaw's Yankees. The lack of any flank support now doomed Shaw as the Texans' attack rolled forward and threatened to overwhelm the isolated brigade of Federals.
With the Federal right in trouble, meanwhile, to the south, Churchill's assault on the Union left was progressing not necessarily as intended, but still successfully.
The difficulty of his forces' movement through the forest and over the broken terrain led Churchill to believe he was farther to the right than he really was. The first sight Churchill's men saw when they emerged from the pine woods was a field sloping down to a dry stream bed 300 yards away. In this tree and brush-filled gully could be seen a line of enemy infantry with skirmishers thrown out front. The Confederates moved swiftly forward, instantly putting the blue skirmish line to flight. With irresistible momentum, they then struck Louis Benedict's brigade. Heavily outnumbered, Benedict's line started to crumble immediately. His 3 New York regiments were put to flight. Then the 30th Maine, outflanked on the left and right, retreated in response to orders from Benedict, who was killed shortly afterward.
As y'all will recall, Benedict's brigade had been Shaw's closest support, and Benedict's collapse meant there was no support on any side for Shaw, who was in danger of being overwhelmed by Walker's Texans. Walker himself was wounded and carried to the rear. Seeing the stubborn resistance of the Federals, Taylor called up Polignac*s weary reserves.
Shaw's position was crumbling under the increasing pressure, and he urged Dwight to move up and help him, but Dwight refused, saying he had no orders to do so. When A.J. Smith sent word for Shaw to withdraw, 3 of his regiments were able to do so, but the 32nd Iowa was surrounded and cut off. Dwight now decided that, orders or no orders, if he didn't move, he'd suffer the same fate as Shaw, so he shifted 2 of his regiments to the south side of the road.
Emory then ordered McMillan's brigade, which had been relieved by Shaw before the fighting began and was now in reserve, to move and fill the gap created by the shift of Dwight's regiments.
McMillan, advancing straight into the teeth of the Confederate fire, saw 3 of his regiments immediately thrown into confusion. One of his men wrote, quote, "The air seemed all alive with the sounds of various projectiles, from the spiteful, cat-like spit of the buckshot, the poof of the old-fashioned musket ball, and the zing of the mini bullet, to the roar of the ordinary shell, while the shrieks of the wounded and horses and the yells of the apparently victorious rebels added to the uproar."
At that point in the battle, the overall federal situation was critical. The Union right and center had all but collapsed, and the left seemed to have evaporated. The only significant portion of Banks' command not yet engaged with the enemy was A.J. Smith's 16th Corps troops, who had started the day positioned in the village.
In a stroke of luck for the embattled Yankees, Smith now found himself in an ideal position to hit the right flank of Churchill's unsuspecting Confederates. Churchill, after hitting and scattering Benedict's brigade of Federals in the dry stream bed, had continued his wheel to the north. But in doing so, he thus exposed his right flank to A.J. Smith, who Churchill didn't suspect was positioned nearby.
The 58th Illinois, which was concealed in a stand of trees, began pouring an accurate fire into Churchill's flank. Other regiments joined in, and then A.J. Smith ordered his entire line to charge the Confederates.
He was joined by some of Benedict's men, and on his right by McMillan's brigade, which had finally succeeded in forming a line behind a board fence in Pleasant Hill. Despite being caught by surprise, Churchill's Confederates made a dogged and determined resistance, contesting every yard, and at times using muskets as clubs in the dense undergrowth along the dry stream bed which they were pushed back to.
As Parsons' division on the right was driven back by the Federal counterattack, the right of Tappan's division was exposed, and it too was forced to retire. Tappan's left brigade, in withdrawing, ran into the right brigade of Walker's division and threw it into disorder.
The Federal counterattack now became a grand right wheel, pivoting on the village. Churchill's Confederates continued to resist stubbornly until they were forced back into the woods. Then, with darkness falling and the Yankees coming on, the rebel withdrawal on the right became touched with panic, and a rout appeared imminent. Churchill and other officers ordered, threatened, and begged in an effort to stop the rush to the rear, but without success, and they were carried along off the battlefield.
Night, difficult terrain, and heavy losses prevented the Federals from making any serious pursuit. As the last rebels disappeared into the gloom of the darkened woods, Banks rode up to A.J. Smith, shook his hand, and exclaimed, "God bless you, General. You have saved the army."
During the battle at Pleasant Hill, the Confederates had appeared to be on the brink of victory, having pushed the Federal right and center to the point of breaking, and seemingly having crushed the Yankee left, only to have the tide of battle turn dramatically against them when their own right was hit by A.J. Smith's unexpected and devastating counterattack.
For the second time in 2 days, Nathaniel Banks was faced with the same question: what to do next? As on the previous night, after the end of the fighting on the 8th, Banks' first inclination was to continue the advance on Shreveport.
And shortly after the end of the fighting at Pleasant Hill, Banks told A.J. Smith it was his intention to continue the march on Shreveport in the morning. But soon thereafter, Banks conferred with Franklin, Emory, and Dwight and found that they opposed any attempt to continue the advance on Shreveport. Franklin and Emory advised marching over to Blair's Landing, where the army could be supplied and reinforced under the protection of Porter's gunboats.
However, Banks' friend Dwight advised retreating back to Grand Ecore, which was undoubtedly the safest thing to do. A move to Blair's Landing would almost certainly have led to another pitched battle with the Confederates at some point, while a retreat to Grand Ecore would leave open the option of going back to Alexandria.
Banks decided to follow Dwight's advice, and he issued orders for a retreat to Grand Ecore. A.J. Smith hadn't attended the meeting, and he was furious when, after midnight, he found out about the plan to go back to Grand Ecore. He stormed over to Banks' headquarters to protest the decision. He loathed the thought of leaving his dead and wounded on the battlefield for the rebels to tend to come morning. Also, his 2,500 men on the Army transports accompanying Porter would be at risk, without benefit of support, if the Confederates moved to cut off the Federal ships on the river. Banks, though, refused to reconsider his decision to retreat to Grand Ecore.
A seething A.J. Smith next went to see William Buell Franklin and asked Franklin to consider placing Banks under arrest and take over command of the expedition. Franklin himself was disgusted by Banks' obvious incompetence and later admitted, quote, "From what I had seen of General Banks' ability to command in the field, I was certain that an operation depending on plenty of troops, rather than upon skill in handling them, was the only one which would have a probability of success in his hands."
But although Franklin may have sympathized with A.J. Smith's argument, he had clearly learned a thing or two in the course of his backstabbing and scheming, trying to get Ambrose Burnside removed from command of the Army of the Potomac, because here Franklin chose not to stick his neck out and simply said, "Smith, don't you know this is mutiny?" And there the matter rested.
The numbers engaged at Pleasant Hill were very nearly equal, with the Federals fielding about 12,200 men in total and the Confederates around 12,500.
Federal losses at Pleasant Hill were 290 killed, 775 wounded, and 1,060 missing. Confederate losses were around 1,200 killed and wounded. After the end of the fighting on the 8th and 9th, the Federals left their dead and many of their wounded on the battlefields, and the Confederate surgeons were quickly overwhelmed with the numbers of soldiers to care for. At both Mansfield and Pleasant Hill, almost every available home, barn, and other building was pressed into service housing the wounded. Many wounded Federal soldiers later noted the kindness they received at the hands of the people of DeSoto Parish.
After midnight in the early morning hours of April 10th, as the Yankees marched off down the road to Grand Ecore, making another retreat, the average soldier was disgusted with Nathaniel Banks and had very little confidence in his command abilities. At Pleasant Hill, the Federals seemed to grasp victory from the jaws of defeat, but what did they have to show for 2 days of hard fighting on 2 different battlefields? Nothing, just another retreat.
Banks had had 7 hours on the 9th to make his dispositions at Pleasant Hill, but had wasted that time, idling away the day, while Dick Taylor prepared to press the advantage he had gained the day before by crushing the Federal vanguard at Mansfield. When the Confederates did strike at Pleasant Hill the afternoon of the 9th, what was essentially the front line of Banks' position was held by just 2 brigades, Shaw's on the right and Benedict's on the left, and both of those commands were overwhelmed early in the contest because of inexcusably poor deployment. With all of this bungling on Banks' part, the Confederates still couldn't close the deal, mostly due to the faulty execution of Dick Taylor's plan. Churchill's command was selected as a flanking force, tasked with rolling up the Federal left, but although he crushed Benedict's brigade at the dry stream bed, Churchill hadn't moved far enough to the right. In the wooded, unfamiliar country, Churchill thought he had moved beyond the Union left, but he was wrong, and so he ended up crossing right in front of A.J. Smith's force, exposing his flank to Smith, and as a result, Churchill was himself rolled up by Smith's devastating counterattack. Churchill realized the chance he had missed, and in his report, admitted that if his line had, quote, extended a half more mile to the right, a brilliant success would have been achieved.
At Mansfield and at Pleasant Hill, one arm of the intended Federal pincers movement upon Shreveport was broken when Banks' force began its retreat back to Grand Ecore.
But at the time, the other Federal pincer, the movement of Frederick Steele's force coming down into Louisiana from Arkansas, was over 2 weeks old. Nathaniel Banks had been thwarted in his advance on Shreveport, but what was going on with Steele's part of the campaign? Well, that's what we'll be covering in the next show. And Tracy and I hope you do join us for that. But until next time, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.